Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. Thank you for downloading. And thank you for subscribing to the latest edition of the 12 Kyle podcast. I am your boy, 12 Kyle. Man, check this out. On this episode, what I want to talk about is albums. More specifically, the perfect album. Now, for some, saying that an album is perfect is blasphemous. Because in essence and in theory, there's no such thing, right? But for other music fans, and I've heard this repeatedly, there is such a thing as a perfect album. And sometimes it really depends on who you ask. I came to this topic because a few days ago, a very popular rapper came out with a new album. I'm not going to talk about it. But, when he dropped his album, I saw a little bit of the chatter on social media. And one comment in particular stood out to me, and they said this was a perfect album. And I'm like, wait a minute. Are you serious? Now, granted, I had not heard the album, but for someone to say that an album was perfect is a stretch. Now, if you follow music or you follow people on social media, I'm sure that most of you listening and watching, and for those of you watching, thank you for watching on YouTube. I appreciate it. You've heard the term classic when it talks to or speaking about albums, right? This is different because if you're saying that an album is classic, that's one thing. It's another thing to say that an album is perfect. And so it got me to thinking, and I started reminiscing about an article that I came across a couple of years ago. And I saved the article because I knew at some point I was going to talk about this particular subject. And that is there such thing as a perfect album? I think it's a stretch to call an album perfect, but I'll play along with the conversation. So as I'm reading this article, it just kind of talks about some of the things that would make an album a perfect album. The word perfect basically stands alone. It's a standalone word, and it lets you know that it's hard to be perfect at anything, right? But here's the catch. When you speak about something being perfect, particularly an album being perfect, you're speaking about what it is the listener hears. Not necessarily what they think, but what they hear first, and then it's their thoughts about what it is that they're hearing. And you can't get it confused because a lot of times I think fans tend to think about what they're hearing instead of focusing on what they're actually hearing. And if you think about it first, you can make an album perfect in your mind, and it's not really perfect, or it's not really good for that matter, or it's not an album that you think it is. And I'll get to that in just a second. Nowadays, a lot of today's music surrounds singles. While singles, particularly are made for the charts or made for, social media, if you will, or made for clicks, I don't really get into singles. And here's a weird thing that I'll admit about myself. If there's an artist that's coming out with an album and they drop a bunch of singles before the album comes out, I don't listen to the singles. I don't. I want to experience the album in its entirety when it comes out. I do my best to avoid the singles. And I've been like this for the last, I'd say probably 10 years or so, because I think what happens is that you can hear a single, and because you don't have the concept or the idea of what the album will be, a single can really throw you off. Case in point, I remember a few years back, my man Kendrick Lamar dropped his album To Pimp a Butterfly. Well, before he dropped To Pimp a Butterfly, he released a single. And I think the single was called I. And you know, it was a pretty decent song. I liked it when I heard it. It wasn't anything groundbreaking, but you really I saw a lot of feedback from people. Oh man, this song is terrible. It's not good, Kid Mad City, which was his previous album. And if you listen to the album To Pimp a Butterfly and you get to that song I, which is on the back half of the album, you understand its placement and you understand how that song actually made the album. You understand why that cut is there. But if you just listen to the single, it may not make as much sense to you as to why that would be on the album, let alone the lead single, right? So I learned a lesson from that, and particularly a lot of backlash, because I saw a lot of people on social media, bashing that particular song. But once they heard the album, it made sense. It made sense, and the song actually fit where it was. It was perfect. Not a perfect album, but it was perfect where it was sequenced and everything, and where the song actually sat on the album. So I said all that to say this. You can have an album and you can really, really like an album, but it might not be perfect. And it's okay. Because in reality, there's probably not anything close to a perfect album. But I'll let you be the judge of it after listening to this podcast. Like I said, the word perfect really creates an idea or a system that you think like, okay, something has to be super, super special. So let's start with the obvious. If you say that an album is perfect, what makes the album perfect? Well, obviously it has to be perfect to the listener, the ear particularly of the listener. If they don't hear it, if they don't hear perfection in their ear, then it's not going to be deemed a perfect album. But here's the thing. When you speak about something being perfect, the word perfect is highly subjective. What I deem perfect and what you deem perfect, probably two different things, right? So that in and of itself is something that you have to kind of consider. But when you start thinking about a perfect album, and this is something that this particular article touched on, you got to kind of put it in certain criteria. And I'll give you just a few things that they talked about as far as the criteria. One, is the album truly a unique album? What I mean by that is, does the album stand alone on its own merit? Is it a situation where there's no other album that sounds like it? When I think about something like that, I might think of, I don't know, Wu-Tang's debut album, Enter the 36 Chambers. That album, if you were around when that album came out, there was nothing that even sounded remotely close like that. RZA had these crazy sounds. You had 9 MCs, and they were all speaking these different languages, if you will, and as far as rap is concerned, a lot of 5% talk. I know people who bought 36 Chambers that still don't know all the words to the songs. They know Can It All Be So Simple, but I mean, that's about it. So, does it have a unique sound? Is it a unique album? A perfect album would stick out. Like its uniqueness would be one of its standout qualities in and of itself. A perfect album in its uniqueness should be groundbreaking. First and foremost, it should be, it might even be revolutionary. But it's going to take you on a musical journey that you had not been on before, right? It's going to do all of those things, and it's going to be based on how it sounds sonically, maybe the musical arrangements, the chords, any and everything that takes you above the surface level of what you're actually listening to. If it gives you the opportunity to have a deep dive based on what you sonically hear, then maybe, just maybe, it might be a perfect album. Another point: can an album captivate you from start to finish? That, my friends, is very tough. A perfect album should captivate you from the beginning of the album until the end of the album, with no lulls in between. What you're asking to do is for the album to take you on a roller coaster ride and keep you on the edge of your seat every single song. You're hanging on to every single verse, every single word, every single bar, no mistakes. That's very tough. From the minute that I hit play, if an album's perfect, I'm not going to want to get away from this album. I am going to be totally engulfed into what it is that I'm hearing, if it's a perfect album. And I think a perfect album will have you from the get-go. I mean, like from the beginning, you will understand, you will feel what it is that you're seeing, what it is that you're hearing, what it is that you're feeling in your soul and in your body, if it's a perfect album. Number 3, can I move myself around the album and still be excited? So can I go from track 1 to track 7 and still be excited about the album? Can I go from track 7 to track 12 and still be excited about what it is that I'm hearing? Can I go from track 12 to track 2? You understand what I'm saying here? It's a journey. So I should be able to pick up on a perfect album. I should be able to pick up on any particular point in the album and not feel like the album has lost any of its luster or any of its steam, if you will. That's a perfect album. And I still be excited about what it is that I'm hearing. Another key point, and I don't want you to get lost in this. A perfect album is timeless. A perfect album is timeless. It spans time. It doesn't feel dated. It doesn't feel like you hear it and you can tell what year it came out. A perfect album is just that. It is perfect as far as the sound goes. The sound, if it was made in 1985, if you listen to it in 2015, it doesn't sound like it was made in 1985. It still sounds as fresh in 2015 as it did in 1985. That is hard to do. But if you have a perfect album, I think that's what will happen. And timeless is very subjective, but hip hop fans in particular, I've seen on social media get into it with each other, calling albums timeless classics. And there can be such a thing. There is such a thing. Now, where it falls, it really depends on the listener. Again, it's all subjective. But if the music is timeless, then maybe you got something. And when I think about timeless, I think about an album like Songs in the Key of Life by Stevie Wonder, right? Now, for me, that is an album that I heard in my household as a youngster growing up. And so one of my, or quite a few of my first musical memories involved that album. So to me, hearing it 40 years later, I mean, it still feels the same to me. But again, this was my musical introduction. So does that take away from the album? No, I don't think so. Does it enhance the album? At least to me, it does. But the flip side is, if you have a kid who in 1994 heard Nas's Illmatic for the first time, and now they're listening to it in 2024, and it's 30 years later, and it sounds just as fresh as it did in 1994, to them, they may think that Illmatic's a timeless album. It could be timeless, but does that make it perfect? We don't know, because we don't necessarily know if there's such a thing as a perfect album. But if you have a perfect album, I think it goes without saying that it would have to be timeless. Next point. Does the album stand up when it's repeated? There are some albums, I think, that when you listen to them, you can play them over and over and over again and not get tired of them. Those are the ones that are special. I'm not just talking about your favorite album, because obviously your favorite album, you're going to play it over and over. But that album that gives it to you, whatever it is, and you can play it, extended replays of it daily, every day. If there's an album that you could play literally all day, that's something. That's saying something. That might be a key component to it being a perfect album. The next point. Will I move mountains, jump over hills, do any and everything I can to own a copy of it? Now, here's where it gets tricky, because personally, I came up in an era where you had to get the physical copy of the album. So the balance and the relationship between consumer and artist went a long way, right? Because I had to physically, if I wanted an album, if I wanted, I don't know, if I wanted The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, if I wanted that album, I had to physically leave my house, get into my car, drive down to the mall or to the Sam Goody or Best Buy or, Tower Records, the local, radio store or record store, and purchase the album. And then I had to get back in my car and drive home and listen to it, or go home, get set up in the house and listen to it and zone out. That was a personal investment. So artists like a Lauryn Hill, knowing that there was a personal investment, made sure that I got my money's worth when I spent $12 to get that CD. So it wasn't, you could tell by listening to the album, the time and the care that she put into that album. And the fans reciprocated the love because they were invested. Today, it's a little different because you don't have to go buy an album. The music is disposable. I mean, a lot of the music is microwavable. You heat it up, listen to it, and then you put it to the side. And, we always talk about how some albums, actually a lot of albums, they're as hot as your timeline is, whether or not your timeline on Twitter or your timeline on Instagram or whatever, or TikTok, whatever it is. It's, a couple of weeks while people are talking about it, maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks at the max. And then after that, they're on to the next album. So they didn't have to go buy the album. We all have streaming. Like, I got Spotify, so I pay a monthly subscription for Spotify. So there's no personal investment. I can listen to an album. You could tell me how great an album is, and I could listen to it once and be done with it and never have to worry about it again. I'll never have to hear it again. And I could be cool because as long as I pay my $11 a month, which used to be $10, but Spotify just went up on us $1. Thanks, Spotify. As long as I pay my money each month, it's cool. It doesn't matter. But when I had to go get that Run DMC CD, it meant a little bit more. When I had to go get that Slick Rick tape, or when I had to go get that New Edition cassette tape, to me, it meant a little bit more because, again, I treated it like something that was going to be there for right now, and I could only have it right now. And I didn't know when the next New Edition album was coming out. I didn't know when the next Slick Rick album was coming out. So I treated it as such. I treated it like it was gold. My personal investment was to go get it and then to keep it and play it over and over and over again. So yeah, even somebody like Prince, who is like my all-time favorite artist, I had to go buy those albums because even though I knew he put out music, you don't know when Prince is coming back out. Hell, one of my favorite artists, D'Angelo, it took D'Angelo, what, 14, 15 years to come out with another album. It happens. Things happen. Life happens. Sometimes people leave us. And all we have is that art. But no, are you willing to move mountains? Are you willing to jump through all kinds of hoops to get to your material? That's something to think about if you're talking about an album that's perfect. The next point. Does the music move me emotionally? I think if you have a perfect album, it should move you emotionally. Does that mean you're going to cry that every time you play a song? Probably not. I mean, if you're playing the Marshall Mathers LP and you think that's a perfect album, I don't necessarily know that there's songs on there that'll make you cry, but it might be. I don't know. I haven't heard the album in years. But you get my point. I think an album that, if you deem that it was perfect, it had to move you emotionally. There's no other way. Like, it will stoke something within you. That's what a perfect album will do. And the last point to be made is that a perfect album is an album that you would recommend to strangers without hesitation. Many of you who listen and watch this podcast hear me talk about some of the albums that I grew up listening, some of my favorite albums, and I've done album reviews on them and things of that nature. And a lot of you are strangers to me. Now, you know me, but I don't know you. And I recommend a lot of songs and a lot of albums that I've heard that I rock to, and I still rock to this day. And I still feel like that. Now, again, I won't go as far as calling an album perfect, but if I told you that you needed to go purchase Ready to Die if you never heard it before, you need to go stream it if you've never heard it before, then I meant that. And I think that you really should, because it was an album that I really connected to. Is it perfect? No, not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. Respect, I think, is terrible, but that's another story for another day. But you get my point. You know, will you recommend the album to a total stranger? I've recommended so much music to you all, and I'll continue to do so on this podcast. But just those are just some of the things. Now, what I did was, even before I started this podcast, what I did was I went to the Google machine and I typed up perfect hip hop album, and I typed up perfect R&B album. So while Google did not render a search for a perfect hip hop album or perfect R&B album, they did give me some of the best of both. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you just a handful. And based on the criteria that I just laid out, you tell me if that's a perfect album. James Brown, Live at the Apollo, came out in 1963. I'll be honest, I've never heard this album. So I probably would have to ask my parents about that. The aforementioned Songs in the Key of Life. Is it perfect? No. But, again, I am very biased when it comes to this album. If you said it was a perfect album, I could push back on it, but I'm not going to argue with you. Prince, Sign of the Times. Nah, it's not perfect. It's not perfect, but it's a damn good album. I love that album. Stevie Wonder again, Inner Visions. Nah, 1973. I was 1 when this album came out. I heard it later in life. It's a super dope album. Not perfect at all. Michael Jackson's Thriller. Hell no. Thriller is a great album, but I think Thriller is a collection of great songs. I don't think it's a cohesive album, but it is a great album, and everybody and their mama got a copy of it. Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On" from 1971. This one, this one's close. This one is very close. D'Angelo, 2000, Voodoo. No, I love this album. This album gets play every 3 weeks from me. But no, it's not a perfect album. Frank Ocean's Channel Orange from 2012. Nah. I thought it was good. Perfect, no. Beyonce's Lemonade from 2016. Is that a perfect album? I don't think so. Now, full disclosure, I've never heard the album before. I mean, why would I listen to Beyonce? But from what I've heard from her fans, from her beehive, if you will, this is a phenomenal album. I always said I was going to listen to it. I just never got around to it. But I will say this. Her core fans seem to love it. Is it perfect? Probably not. I'm pretty sure you could probably find one or two songs that are skips or just not as good as the rest of the album. Janet Jackson's Control. This is a fire album. It's not perfect. And last but not least, the R&B album that I mentioned a little earlier, The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, which is a R&B album. I'm tired of y'all putting it on hip-hop lists. I said it before and I'll say it again until I'm blue in the face. The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill is not a hip-hop album. She only raps on like 2 tracks. It's an R&B album. It's a neo-soul album. That being said, it's not a perfect album at all. It's a damn good album. Very, very good, but it's not perfect. Now let's go to the hip-hop side. And again, these are just random albums that I'm picking. Nas is Illmatic. Now, if you guys know me, you know that Nas is one of my favorite MCs. Illmatic is probably my favorite hip-hop, one of my favorite hip-hop albums of all time. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect. I mean, you could take off the intro. The biggest knock that I've always had on Illmatic is that it's too short. So that doesn't make it perfect, but it's pretty close. But again, I'm biased. So where do you draw the line in your fandom of an album and how good the album actually is? The aforementioned To Pimp a Butterfly. Phenomenal album. My favorite Kendrick Lamar album, period. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect. It's not perfect at all. I mean, there's a couple of tracks you could probably move around or move off the album totally. They're not skips for me, but, you know, it's not a perfect album. It's not perfect at all. Ready to Die, the aforementioned Ready to Die, Notorious Big, 1994. Nah, not perfect at all. Not perfect at all. How about Dr. Dre's The Chronic from 1992? No, I mean, it's not perfect. I mean, there's a theme there. There's a lot of, you know, misogyny. There's a lot of, you know, gangster talk. I mean, it's a great album. Dope album, genre changing album. It ain't perfect. All Eyes on Me? No, I don't think All Eyes on Me is Tupac's best album anyway. So, The College Dropout, Kanye's first album, 2004. Great album. I don't like Kanye personally, but it's a great album. Love the album. I'll probably never listen to that album again just because I don't like Kanye anymore. Is it perfect? Nah. Reasonable Doubt, Jay-Z, phenomenal. Phenomenal album. Not perfect. And last but not least, Straight Outta Compton, NWA, 1988, the greatest year in hip-hop. Is this a perfect album? Nah. Express Yourself is watery. Arabian Prince song that dance, was it something to dance to? Nah, not cutting it at all. But I love it. And it's an incredible album and it changed things. So that's just me running through just a bunch of random albums. I think overall, if we really are honest, it's hard to find a perfect album. In conclusion, the word perfect makes it that much harder to prove that it is. You probably have an easier time proving that an album isn't perfect than proving that it is. And I think when we're talking about perfect albums, we have to remove our feelings, remove our biases from what it is that we think and what it is that we hear. Because again, if what you're hearing isn't perfect, it can't be a perfect album. And I think a lot of times us as fans of R&B, fans of hip hop, fans of, rock and roll, I think we get it a little bit confused. Just because it sold a lot of records doesn't mean it was a great record. I mean, Vanilla Ice sold a bunch of records. I've never bought a Vanilla Ice single in my life. Tone Loc sold a bunch of records. He sold more records than Rakim. Nobody's confusing Tone Loc with Rakim. So, in essence, to claim perfection, it would have to be an album that embodied almost everything that I mentioned, plus a little bit more. And while you can find some albums that have some things, I don't think you're going to see a whole bunch of albums that have everything. And that makes it not a perfect album. Does a perfect album exist? Probably not. But I'll let you tell me. Ladies and gentlemen, that's going to do it for me. Thanks again for checking out this edition of the 12 Kyle podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast. You can find the podcast on YouTube. That's right. We have our own YouTube channel. Go to YouTube, search 12 Kyle podcast, subscribe, share it with your friends. Also hit the notification button. That way you get notifications when the podcast comes out. Now, one of the great things about it being on YouTube is that we have not only audio, but video as well. So you get a chance to see or listen to the podcast. If you're listening, you can find a podcast anywhere. We're on all streaming platforms, wherever you get your podcast. We're also on social media. Hit me up on social media at 12Kyle, at 12Kyle Podcast. I'm on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, TikTok. Have our own TikTok page under 12 Kyle Podcast where we have clips of each and every episode. If you want to support the podcast financially, we sell merch. If you look in the description box, there's a link that says merch. Click that link. You can get 12 Kyle Podcast t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, posters, much, much more at a very affordable price. And if you feel so inclined and you want to throw us a couple of dollars, hey, I'll take it. Cash App, $TWELVEKYLE. Again, that's going to do it for me. I am your boy 12 Kyle. And we'll catch you guys next time. 5,000.